Joining us on our monthly on Mondays for March 9th, 2026. Today we have Dr. Georg Streeter, Research Integrity Officer for UC Irvine. Dr. Streeter received a Bachelor of Science from Cornell, got his PhD from the University of California, San Diego, and then pursued a postdoc at the California Institute of Technology. And he's currently a professor of neurobiology and behavior at UC Irvine, where his research focuses on how and why brains and behavior of vertebrates, particularly birds, have changed over time evolutionarily. He's also written several books, including a neuroscience textbook and a book on the use of animals in cell culture models in biomedical research. So he's also a fellow of the AAAS and received a Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. So he's a card-carrying scientist, biological scientist, so he should be able to speak to our audience very well. He has a short presentation to provide us, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers about research integrity, navigating authorship, data ownership, misconduct, and questionable research practices, which I clearly know nothing about, George. So why don't you help us get started?
Okay. Thank you all for being here. You can see my slide?
Indeed, we can.
Okay. So thanks for having me. I do a fair number of research integrity related presentations on campus, but usually I talk to trainees, and I love doing that, but it's also, I think, very important to periodically talk to faculty and senior researchers in general. So here's a rough outline of what I thought might be good topics to talk about. I have one slide on each of these, and my intention is to sort of stop after every couple of slides and take some questions, but you're also welcome to interrupt me when you see fit. So I thought maybe we can start with authorship disputes. You'd be amazed how often they come up. And they are not technically research misconduct. A lot of people will contact our office, which I work with the Office of Research, and as a research integrity officer, people come to me and say, can you help us resolve this authorship dispute? And we usually send it back to the schools or try to get it resolved at some lower level. But that doesn't mean they aren't serious, right? They are fairly common, and they can really lead to trouble. So sometimes the topic comes up of whether we should have an official campus policy on authorship, and I really don't like sort of prescribing a particular policy on like who should be first author and so forth, because disciplines differ, right? In some disciplines it's alphabetical and so forth. But there are these, there is this COPE, it's called the Committee on Publication Ethics. They have a pretty good set of criteria for how you might think about authorship and who should get credit as an author. And they really discourage things like ghost authorships, where you have, say, a company writing a paper and then somebody else is the official author, or gift authorships where basically an author doesn't do anything, but you give it to them because you want to be in their good graces, for example. I'm sure you've all had, experiences with journals where they ask you to sort of confirm, what have you done? What have you contributed to this? And in terms of authorship agreements, I think it is good to have them. I think a lot of us know that it's good to talk early and often about, like, who's going to be an author on this paper once we write it. But I think if you can get yourself to do it, having a written authorship agreement is something that works well at a bunch of different universities, and I encourage people to do that. Because then, different people have different memories if you just have a conversation, and that can be a problem. Sometimes, the authorship agreement would include things like who should be first author, who should be senior author. Sometimes you have joint authorships, right? And then even with joint first authorship, you have to ask, okay, which of the first two first authors should be the first author? It gets complicated. And so I think it's really good to talk about these things. And then also to revisit the agreement once the project, if the project changes, say if some new collaborators join in, that would be the time to talk about, okay, how does that change? Who's going to be an author on these papers? So that's my little thing about authorship disputes. And let's see here. A related topic is data ownership, right? Because this sometimes comes up when somebody is disgruntled or is upset about not being somehow disagrees about the paper and they want to withdraw their authorship. And then they might say, well, I don't want you to publish the data that I generated. And that brings up the question of who owns the data. And technically, the university owns all of our data. I know it doesn't feel like it, but it technically, they get the grant money, they own the data, and the PIs basically serve as stewards for the data. So if people leave the institution, they should leave the data here and just take copies with them. You probably heard about material transfer agreements. So if you have material that needs to be sent to another institution, say transgenic animals or special reagents, you can there are mechanisms for transferring those things. In terms of data management, the question that comes up fairly often is how long do you have to retain data? The NSF and NIH have requirements that you have to save your data for at least 3 years after the last grant report. And to be honest, I don't know exactly, when you have a renewed grant, I think you just keep saving the data until 3 years after you're done with that particular grant. So that can be a fairly long period of time. In general, I think it's really good to keep old data as long as possible and organized in such a way that if someone asks you, hey, you published this figure in this paper, 5 years ago, can you show me the raw data that came from? That, for most of us, is very, very difficult to do because most of us are not that organized. And I should say, I preach this stuff, but boy, I sure didn't follow a lot of this advice myself. So I'm not taking moral high ground here. But it does happen that if somebody is questioning an old paper of ours, that they might want to see the underlying data. And then it's really nice if you can produce it, even if technically you don't have to. Data management plans, right? We all have to, I think for most funding institutions, you now have to submit a data management plan. And I think a lot of us take that very seriously. But then I think after a couple of years, this lab turnover, it might not, be topmost of your mind to actually train your people in management, data management. And I've seen cases where PIs thought that everybody knew how to manage the data, but the people in the lab didn't actually follow the plan, and that can be a problem. So that little blue dot here means that I should stop now for some questions, and maybe even stop my share for a minute. Are there any questions on any of this?
Yes.
Brian is always good for questions.
Yeah, so I just say I'm guessing that you put data management and authorship first because that's what happens. Those issues come up the most in your office.
They come up very often, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And UCI, so just to be clear, UCI doesn't have a formal set of guidelines on authorship. That falls on the individual PIs.
That is correct. That is correct. If you all want more policies, we can probably come up with one. But I would be reluctant to sort of impose a policy. I've talked to people at other institutions. They try to have even I think one university, I forget which one, had an incentive program. You got a little bit of money if you created an authorship program within your lab, and it's basically with your various co-authors. If you produced a written agreement, then you would get some sort of incentive.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think it's better than dictating policy. You must do this, you must do that. Basically, and then the idea would be that it sort of spreads by word of mouth as people complain about experiences they're having. They say, "Oh, this is how we solved it," and so forth.
Right. So
So,
I will say, and people are welcome to email me afterwards. Eileen Anderson and I have a authorship guideline. It's a guideline for neuroscience. As Georgia said, it doesn't fit every discipline, and it's a guideline. The bottom line of our guideline is the final. We try to have a plan, but it's you can't anticipate everything, and so it really falls on the PI in the end to be the final arbitrator. But even if you don't, you need to have that conversation with your lab members, with your staff or your postdocs, your mentees, because if you've never had that conversation, nobody has an idea of what your authorship plans are, and that's
yeah.
definitely not a good way to start off.
And I think that is a general problem that we as PIs often assume that everybody understands this, but the people that work for us don't necessarily see it the way we see it unless we talk to them about it. All right, should I go on?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Um, okay. So I thought at some point I need to talk about research misconduct because that is sort of one of my official functions. That if there's an allegation of research misconduct somewhere, I get called in to assess the situation and then try to sort of supervise the process, which usually involves faculty, sort of a committee of faculty members looking at the situation. I don't actually I don't run the investigation personally. So you may not know that the federal government mandated that we change our policy. Basically, the federal government changed its policy, and now all the universities and other research institutions have to revise their policy accordingly. So we did that. So we have a new policy that's been posted since January. The official definition of research misconduct is that it includes fabrication and falsification of the research record, which can mean a publication, but it doesn't have to be a published manuscript. It can be a grant application. It can be a public presentation with a slideshow where if somebody is including falsified data in that presentation, that would be a problem. And it includes plagiarism. Now, there's some interesting exceptions. This in the new policy and explicitly accepts self-plagiarism and common knowledge. So self-plagiarism is essentially if you try to, plagiarize yourself either by taking, say an introduction to your grant, it becomes an introduction to your manuscript, as something many of us have done. That would not be considered research misconduct. I personally still have a problem with if somebody is trying to publish the same work twice. And I think there are other, ethical issues, other ethical decision makers that come into play there, like journal editors would maybe not like that. But it is not technically research misconduct according to the federal policy. And common knowledge is just for example, if you're describing a technique, there may not be many different ways to describe the technique. So you're using common knowledge description, and that would not be considered plagiarism as well. What plagiarism does include is the theft of ideas or processes or results. So this can happen, right? That somebody reviews a manuscript or a grant application and says, wow, that's a good idea. I could really run with that. And they might even turn down the grant application and then run with the idea themselves. I don't think it happens as often as people might think, but it certainly would be considered research misconduct if you're essentially violating the confidentiality of what you're being asked to evaluate. Plagiarism does not include credit disputes among collaborators. So this is a little bit like authorship disputes are not research misconduct. And so credit disputes, like when you have a collaboration between, say, two labs and they have a falling out, and then there's a question of like who gets to publish what. That can get very complicated and messy, but it would not be officially research misconduct. Okay.
Could you give an example, George, of a credit dispute? It's a little
no, I don't have one in my head.
Without naming names. Like this is if let's
if
say I have cells and I generate cell samples and I give them to a collaborator to do RNA-seq and bioinformatics on them, and so they do. Now there's a data set, and now we have a falling out. They've got the data, but I also have the data.
right,
Um, is
I
that
think
what
that's
it's
a good
like?
example.
Who gets to use that data set?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I think credit could also be like an invention. If you're, through a collaboration, you had a series of conversations, you end up with a really good idea that is original. And now somehow you have a falling out. And then the question is, who gets to publish that idea, right? That can get really messy. So try not to have any original ideas, and you won't have any problems. Okay.
No, just get to the patent office first.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is about sort of who races to get credit first, right? And our system still works often by, precedence. Whoever publishes it first gets the credit. Sometimes maybe that one should think about that. Okay. So here is some advice on how you might protect yourself against research misconduct, because that's how largely I look at it. For the sort of at the PI level, I think most of us, vast majority of us, are not interested in committing research misconduct, but we can get sort of surprised by it. We may be working with students or collaborators, and suddenly we're embroiled in research misconduct and we have no idea. So I think one thing that one can do nowadays is to run papers and grant applications through misconduct detecting software. So you may have heard about Authenticate. That's basically turnitin.com for scientific papers, and they look for plagiarism, basically. And a lot of journals use that. So you don't want to be told by a journal, hey, do you realize you plagiarized this other paper? You want to find that out before you submit to the journal so that you can change it. Same with these image analysis programs. So the big ones are Proofig and Image Twin. What they're really good at is using artificial intelligence to see if any of your images match other images that have been published either in your own manuscript or in other manuscripts, and they can detect things like, if you rotated the image or you change the contrast or all sorts of things they can now detect. And again, I think you want to be able to do that yourself before you sort of have a journal tell you, hey, there's a problem with your manuscript. And that's a real thing. This happens. Maybe it's not even the journal that does it, but there is now there are now these data integrity sleuths who basically go through papers and look for this kind of problem and using these software, and then they contact the journal. So this is not something fun. At the campus level, we've wondered, do we want to have an institutional subscription to some of this software? That's debatable, because then the next step, I suspect, is that they're going to want everyone to run their grant applications through it, maybe even the papers, and then you have more and more restrictions on faculty. So I'm not in favor of too much regulation there, but I think everyone should be, practicing a little self-defense. I've already
So,
managed.
George,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, does that mean that, for example, Authenticate is a paid thing that
Yeah.
individual would have to subscribe to?
Yes, and so is Proofig. I think Image Twin, you sort of pay per scan. So it's a question of, they have different pricing models. Depends a little bit on what you're trying to do. But yeah, it does cost a little bit of money. So yeah, if you want to, push the Office of Research to make site licenses available, that would be fine. I think it's just then you have to be ready that they might start forcing you to use these programs, which then I think a lot of people are going to resent, if you will. Train lab members in record keeping. Again, I never had training in how to run how to keep a good laboratory notebook, and boy, if anyone ever looked at my old lab notebooks, they would not consider me worthy of being a research integrity officer. So, um, and I just was never trained. And nowadays, I think there's quite a few people who are transitioning to electronic lab notebooks. Some of them can be linked to these open science resources. You may be aware that there's this thing called the Open Science Framework, which is basically a huge digital uh, universe where you can deposit data, you can deposit your lab notebooks, and basically have everything be very transparent. We can debate the pros and cons of that, but I think there are definitely some pros. UCI also has or the UC system has a data repository called Dryad. And if you go to the science library, they actually have a person who is an expert in data management plans, and they can walk you through all of that if you want. This next point is something that came up in a conversation I had with actually my brother-in-law, who runs a genetics lab. And he says, one of the things I did is that I really talk to my lab and make it very clear that they do not have to give me data that fits my favorite hypothesis. I actually encourage them to, challenge our hypotheses, and it's okay to bring data that don't fit. And I think this is one of those things where PIs maybe say, oh, of course I accept that. But a lot of the people that work in our labs don't necessarily see it that way. They might expect us to want only data that fit. And so having explicit conversations around that kind of thing, I think would ward off research misconduct by somebody who works in your lab. Sort of take the pressure off a little bit. And here I just submitted a manuscript yesterday, and they ask all the authors to guarantee that the manuscript is does not contain any falsifications and so forth. And so I think one should ask, and when in doubt, ask questions because, so I authored something with two people in Spain. I don't see their data, right? I don't know exactly what they're doing, but I feel like would feel comfortable asking questions if I ever have any doubt about something they're doing. Here's another blue dot making me stop for questions if anyone has any.
Anybody? So if you want to ask a question in the chat you could direct it to Nimisha or I, and we can ask it for you if you don't want to be outed as the person asking. But I will ask, George,
Yeah.
what are the whistleblower protections for faculty or postdocs, graduate students who suspect misconduct, particularly against senior folk? And do these actually are they meaningful in practice?
I know what I'm supposed to say, and that is that they are just like for everything. If you're a whistleblower and you're seeing sexual harassment somewhere, right, or any kind of misuse of funds, it's the same thing for research misconduct. We really try very hard to protect whistleblowers. The reason why I'm hesitating a little bit is if you have a small lab, and suddenly there's an allegation that comes out of that lab. People are going to try to guess like who is making an allegation against me. So that is something that if somebody came to me, I would have a conversation with them about that. How can we avoid, how can we reduce the problems with that? In particular, retaliation is a gigantic no-no. So if you then find that, the PI or whoever, suspects person, such and such individual, then if they suddenly cut their hours or something like that, then the whistleblower protection apparatus would kick in. So we work closely with the Office of the, I forget what they're called, the whistleblower office, Kristen Kwanbeck's shop, and so there's a lot of punishment that will come your way if you retaliate against someone on either a real or imagined allegation. So, yeah.
George, I have another
Nimisha.
question.
Yeah, Nimisha.
What's the practical difference between like research misconduct when you talked about fabrication, falsification, plagiarism versus like an honest error? And then who at UCI like makes that determination and that process?
Okay. So yeah, honest error is by federal definition not research misconduct. Okay. And the criterion there is not beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's a preponderance of evidence standard, just like in civil proceedings. So who at UCI? So, my job as research integrity officer would be to sort of read the allegation when it first comes in, talk to a few people maybe, and try to assess like, okay, if this were true, would it be research misconduct? So I wouldn't actually know for sure. I would just say, would it fit the definition, right? And if it would fit the definition and it is a credible allegation, then I would say, okay, we need to seat a committee of faculty, so usually 3 faculty, um, to look at the case and evaluate. And that is okay. Um, Yeah, and so then there's an inquiry stage and an investigation stage, and I guess the policy now changed. So actually, the research integrity officer can do an inquiry by themselves, or with a subject matter expert, or with a committee if the case is really complicated. But the idea is that before any sanctions would happen or any finding is made, there would be a committee of faculty members who are making the decision. So yeah, so it's never just a research integrity officer. They're there because they supposedly understand the rules and they have to collect evidence and they have to help analyze the evidence, but they don't actually make decisions. That's what you wanted to know?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll ask one more, George,
Sure.
which is provocative in that the time between an allegation and resolution could actually, be a year or more. And during that window, the accused postdoc or faculty member is off publishing more and supervising more trainees. So what does UCI do to mitigate harm, or can they do anything to mitigate harm while an investigation is going on? And the converse of that is, and then what if uh, no no misconduct is
Right.
found, yet people's reputations are harmed?
Right. So these are all explicitly addressed in the policy, but they're all troublesome, right? So let's take that case. First of all, let's consider that this tends to take way longer than you think it should. Okay. And part of that is having run a couple of these investigations, just trying to get, 3 busy professors to agree on a time to meet and then to get witnesses and, people to interview. That all just takes a really long time. I really worry about the last thing you said, which is sort of, if you're ultimately not finding someone culpable for research misconduct, have you caused them any harm? So I think there are 2 things. One is you should, be as confidential as you can be, and very strong instructions to that investigating committee to be very confidential so that there isn't any conversation outside of the committee about this allegation. So really maintain confidentiality. And then we do have in the policy that the campus should make every effort to restore somebody's reputation if it was harmed in any way. So that would be like, sometimes people who are accused themselves then publicize it, right? Or somebody publicizes it. And so without the institution doing it, but then the institution should try at least to, put out the fire, basically. Yeah. And, in the meantime, you mentioned in the meantime, if somebody is doing potentially harm, to science or to people, it's very clear the policy says if there is a risk to patients or misuse of funds, that kind of thing, then you can come down and clamp down hard without waiting for the whole process to unfold. So no patients would be harmed while you're waiting around for people to meet on a committee.
Right. Dan.
I was involved with the case up at a UC. It was actually nationally, it was in the New York Times, etc. But essentially misconduct was detected by other outside investigator who
Right.
detected sort of anomaly in the research. So of course, then that got the attention of the integrity office at one of the UC. I was involved because I was one of the expert witness, but I remember in that case, the investigation was very, very extensive. So just, giving a comment. I'm not sure how, you know, once a complaint is made, how it's done at UCI, but the investigation can get very, very technical and very complicated, and that could take a long time. Uh, and another comment that I wanted to share relates to the authorship. When I moved to UCI, like almost like 13, 14 years ago, there was a lot of investigator who had the I think, notion that if you sort of have a sort of a fee for service type contribution,
Mhm.
even though there's a significant intellectual input which warrant co-authorship, they think that if you pay for, say, a consulting for a few hours or whatever, then that, negates authorship, which is, I think, a lot of people have that misunderstanding.
Yeah. That is a problem, and you can imagine a gray zone, right, where a more intensive consultantship might warrant authorship in some situations, right? But sometimes, you sort of like you just give an authorship to someone because you want to maybe collaborate with them in the future, or you want to be able to rely on them again. And I think journals have tried to be clear, like those COPE guidelines. They really try to do that, to specify what is good practice and what isn't. But it's, who's going to enforce these things? That's the other thing, right? Do we really want somebody who will tell us so we have to justify every author and every author position? I think we probably don't want that. Yeah. Okay.
You want to go back to your slide deck, George?
Yeah, I have just a few more.
And again, if you have any questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat, folks.
This is a hot topic, right? And I think there was I just was in a webinar UC-wide with somebody, an expert, was talking about how to use AI in research. Clearly, the regulatory frameworks are still under development. This area is changing so fast. Nobody can write regulations, it seems. The bottom line is be transparent. If you use AI for anything, you should say so. When it comes to research misconduct, I'm waiting for the day that somebody tells me, oh, I didn't know. I didn't make up that reference. It was AI. That is not a valid excuse, right? So you need to verify and check as many things as you can. And the thing I worry about is we all talk about AI hallucinations, say for references, but if it's making up references, what else is it making up? So I worry that about, especially sort of in the context of having AI do your data analysis. It's really hard to know for sure, and I think at a minimum, one should see whether the AI data analysis is repeatable. Does it come up with the same answers? If repeatedly, if you use a different AI, you're going to get very different answers, and I think that's going to be an interesting area to evaluate. Some people, a fair number of people, are now using AI to write manuscript reviews. I think we can all relate to those reviews that we're overdue on, and boy, it's tempting to just feed the PDF into ChatGPT and have it write a review. There's obvious problems with confidentiality. If you submit confidential information to an AI, that is probably not okay. Journals, many journals forbid it. And so here's something interesting. Some authors have figured out how to try to manipulate AI reviews. So what they do is they take a white part of your manuscript and they put, in very small lettering, they put text in white font, so you can't read it, but a machine reading your document can read that text. And if that text is an instruction to the AI to give it a positive review, that apparently can work. So I just think this is kind of a crazy new universe of possible misbehavior there.
Oh, and I was going to thank you for that tip. That's really clever.
It is clever. There was a Nature article. If you follow the editorial pages of Nature, they have a lot, and Science, they have a lot of these kinds of things in there. My general philosophy, maybe, if I have one, is, from Robert Merton, that science is organized skepticism, and I think we all need to be very skeptical, not just of other people's science, but also our own. In terms of other people's science, you may have seen news items about paper mills. We've had paper mills for a long time, but now with AI, paper mills are just running wild. They're just cranking out papers and then selling them basically so you can be an author on a paper that you had nothing to do with, that AI generated. There was something in Nature about how to spot fraudulent papers. That was an essay actually written by some of these data integrity sleuths. Here is something interesting. A lot of retracted papers still get cited frequently. People just don't know. How would you even know? But I use a program called Zotero for my bibliography. Many of you probably use EndNote. The most recent versions of EndNote, they actually are linked to the Retraction Watch database. And so they let you know which papers have been retracted. And hopefully you won't be citing those papers. I assume maybe some of you have heard of PubPeer. I think that's what was mentioned earlier in the question, when sometimes outside people are critiquing a manuscript. So PubPeer is basically a post-publication commentary platform. So if I don't like something in a paper, I can post comments there on that paper. I can even do that anonymously, which was, some people got upset about that and actually took it to court, but the courts agreed with PubPeer that it's okay to post commentaries anonymously. Journals pay attention to that. Sometimes it's not uncommon for journals to say, or NIH even, to say, hey, your papers have a lot of PubPeer commentary there, and it suggests that there's some misconduct in your paper. Please look at this. When I download a new paper, I like to just, if there's a PubPeer comment, my Google browser flags that for me because I have an extension installed. And then I just read it. A lot of PubPeer comments are kind of garbagey, to be honest. I think they're not very helpful, but every once in a while you find that somebody has already flagged some problems in the paper that you're looking at. Trust but verify, I mean, it's kind of a joke, right? But one can try to verify things. You don't, science is built on trust, right? But one can try to verify. And like in my own lab, I sit down with students and try to spot check. And if they get really squiggly and nervous, then I ask some more questions, right? And here, this reckless thing is an important point, that when you're trying to figure out if a PI is responsible for misconduct that was conducted in their lab, say by a postdoc or a student, the question comes up, was that intentional, or were they negligent, or were they reckless? If you're just negligent, you probably are not going to have a finding against you. But if you were reckless, that's a problem. And reckless, so the new policies try to define that. It's a difficult distinction to make. But if you should have known that there were problems, if you already knew that there were problems somewhere in your lab and that there was an environment where, it was, research misconduct was made very likely, then you probably would be found as having acted recklessly, and that can be a problem. One thing I struggle with, wonder what you guys think about this, but often nowadays we are living in such a collaborative science era where you seek out collaborators who have very different expertise from your own. How are you supposed to verify the work of, somebody is doing some genomics analysis that you don't understand? And that is a very, very difficult challenge. And I think, again, asking questions should be okay among collaborators. But I also have no illusions that, that this is difficult. Any questions at this point? How are we doing time-wise? Okay, I'm doing okay. I think till 6:15 or till 6?
6:15.
Okay.
So we have time for
I only have 2 more slides, so perfect.
All right. Well, I guess I will save my question then for the end. It's about, some advice just on how PIs, how would you advise new folks to set things up so that they can avoid as many things as possible? But let's see, pause for a moment, see if anyone has a question. Sometimes they're just shy.
I know.
The peaceful.
We're all busy people. They're probably sitting there on their computers trying to listen at the same time. I understand. We're all
I'm sure they are. So, all right. Why don't we do the last couple slides?
All right, last 2 slides.
Yep.
Okay, we'll do it.
I would comment while you had that slide up about how do you validate things for your collaborators. And I guess I would just comment of one way I think of it, and maybe you can address this, is when we're submitting the paper, nowadays papers are much clearer that, this lab or these 3 people with their initials contributed to figure 4 and 5.
Yes.
These people did all the RNA-seq, and this person did the statistical pipeline analysis. And so I'm looking at that as, and maybe I'm wrong, so I didn't claim I did the RNA-seq. So if there's a problem with the RNA-seq, I'm going to be unhappy, but at least the peers will realize that I'm not the one who made that mistake.
Yes, and I think that is, a big change actually in that now many journals do that. They ask you for spell out your contribution, and it does offer you some protection. But I've also been involved in some cases where people are found, I just submitted, I just provided some, the animals or something like that. I didn't actually do the work. I just provided some materials, if you will. Special materials. If that paper gets retracted, you're still going to be mad, right? You're still going to be tainted a little bit because it doesn't look great, right, to have a paper retracted. And so I think of it as protection, not just against, a misconduct finding, which is probably unlikely, but anyway, but just protection against sort of the being tainted by, if one of your co-authors is found guilty of misconduct, it's almost inevitable you will get tainted, even if there was no finding against you. And this certainly affects young people in a lab. I remember a case of a behavioral scientist at Harvard a number of years ago who was found guilty of misconduct. And there were a lot of postdocs and graduate students who were just really upset that, that their career chances were now in turmoil, even though the misconduct was clearly done by the PI, not by them. So that's why I try to emphasize, protecting yourself by identifying problems before they come to bite you, because sometimes there have been cases, very clear cases, of misconduct where afterwards you look and you go, how can the other authors have missed this? How can the reviewers have missed this? How can I saw one in an Elsevier journal, the introduction starts, sure, here's an introduction you can use. Okay, so clearly the answer to an AI prompt was in the very first sentence of the paper, and you go, how can these people not have noticed? I get worked up about this. I'm sorry.
Wow.
But I think all of us need to be a little bit more skeptical and not just sort of blindly trust. This is a little bit of my hobby horse, perhaps, but I think research misconduct is actually quite rare. What is much more common are these what we call questionable research practices. So just to give some examples, many studies are underpowered, right? And yes, underpowered studies are not ideal because they often can't demonstrate real effects, but they also can lead to false positives. So a study with small sample size can show you, oh, there's a really interesting, surprising finding that, my statistics say is significant. but if you had a larger sample size, you might find out that that was a hallucination, if you will. But you can publish something like that, right? So a lot of papers get published with low power, and often they're actually interesting findings because nobody expected it. But they can, in the long run, fail to replicate. Failure to control for multiple comparisons. I think most of us know that problem, and there are, of course, different ways to adjust for that. You mentioned RNA-seq, right? So I think there's some interesting debates in some around RNA-seq. How do you adjust your p-values? Should you use, Bonferroni? Probably not. But should you maybe use Benjamini Hofberg, false discovery rates, and so forth. So the idea is if you don't adjust for multiple comparisons, you sort of exaggerate how statistically significant your findings look, and that's a little misleading. This is even more sort of controversial form of p-hacking. A lot of us do that, right? We collect some data and then we analyze it and say, oh, we got p equal 0.052, collect another 10 animals, data from another 10 animals and see if we can get it below 0.05. People could argue about that. I think a lot of us do that, but in general, it's considered bad practice. So I think QRPs, these questionable research practices, definitely contribute to the replication crisis because sort of almost by definition, these are they don't lead to very robust findings. Here's an interesting thing I'd like you to think about is I think of QRPs as sort of shortcuts to publication. They make it a little easier to publish a lot of papers if you take those shortcuts. And so that then increases the pressure to publish for everyone, right? Because your neighbor is publishing, well, oh my God, that lab is cranking out a paper a week. Maybe I should be publishing more. Certainly my committee thinks I should. And maybe that then leads to research misconduct where people take shortcuts that are more clearly misconduct. Some people have called the questionable research practices the steroids of scientific competition, like, people bulking up by injecting steroids, and it's kind of a, doping scandal. I mean, to be a little controversial here, but I think it's an important issue. And the last slide here is, the big question is how do we change the incentive structure? My personal feeling is that there's been way too much emphasis in the last, 15 years on flashy stories to the point where we're now teaching our grad students how to bring out the story and sell your story as strong as you can, even when your data is just barely existent. And I think also, a lot of labs now have, a whole section on our lab in the media. And I think that is problematic one. And I prefer sort of the slower but more stable scientific approach where you come at try to build a really strong foundation for your findings. Personnel committees. I have been on our campuses committee on academic personnel. In fact, I chaired it for you. And when you have to evaluate that many people, it is very tempting to start just counting numbers of papers. Look at how many grant dollars they bring in, and it's very hard. It's easy to say reward quality, not quantity, but how are you supposed to evaluate quality if you're not an expert in the area? So this is a very challenging problem, but I think we should try. A big thing in the open science world is this idea of pre-registration of experiments, where you do what people have been doing for a number of years now for clinical trials, where you pre-register, and where you basically describe, this is the experiment I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do it, this is what I expect to find, this is how I will analyze it. And I'll make things transparent. There is, I think, a problem with doing, I wouldn't want all experiments to be just pre-registered, because in a real world lab environment, you often have to sort of, do things by the seat of your pants, where you're improvising, playing around a little bit, you're doing exploratory work. But I think one can solve that problem by distinguishing clearly between exploratory studies and sort of almost preclinical studies where you really need to be sure that the results are strong. Don't look down on replication attempts. I plead guilty that when um, many of you know about Ozzie Stewart, right? Doing a number of years ago, he got a big grant to replicate a bunch of research studies in spinal cord injury. And when I heard about that, I thought, well, he must have lost his drive to do original work. And that was, I feel like a bit of a schmuck now in retrospect, because I think that was a very important set of studies that highlighted that many of the studies in that area were not replicating, and it led to important, I think, changes in what people expect from those kinds of experiments. And then finally, I think, it's important to promote a culture of scientific rigor and find some way to take the pressure off young scientists. I know that there's some labs that actually like young scientists to be as pressurized as possible because then they produce more. And they probably do, but at some point you're also promoting bad science. So this is a delicate balancing act. Thank you, and I'm really open to hearing from you either now or privately later on. As Brian pointed out, my name does not seem to be on the Office of Research website, but my name is findable at UCI. And, I like talking about this stuff.
Well, thank you. Namisha, you unmuted. Did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say thank you so much, George. This is very informative. As someone who doesn't do a lot of research, I learned a lot today. So thank you for this.
All right. Well, I do have one quick closing question, which will get me in trouble with the Vice Chancellor for Research, but that will be entertaining. So, George, research integrity infrastructure at most universities is under-resourced relative to the volume of potential crises. So how is UCI's Office of Research doing? Are we adequately staffed? Are you empowered to do your job? Or what does it take? What will it take to change things? Or are we at a good balance?
When I became Research Integrity Officer, I was sent to a couple of conferences where I got to learn what other people are doing at other institutions. And what was interesting is that the universities with the most well-developed research integrity apparatus, if you will, were the ones that had scandals. Because then the resources start flowing. And I think at this point we are in a state that is results from not had any scandals. Okay, so I think we are a little bit under-resourced. I'm doing this job just as my service to the university. I'm not getting paid extra for it, and I love that I work with a very competent person, Jill Kay, in the Office of Research, who does get paid for doing this. But I sometimes worry that if she were to leave or somehow, if she were not there, we would be in big trouble, because I for one, I'm not sure I could do my job without her. And so I think a good, strong research integrity apparatus at a university would have like a small group of people. The problem is the workload for research integrity or research misconduct investigation is very hard to predict. In one year, you might have 4 investigations, and another one 0. So do you want all these staff members sitting around waiting for research misconduct to happen? So it's a tricky thing to do. You basically have to integrate it into a larger team, where then people can be moved around as needed. That's what they're doing. So, yeah.
Well, we'll solve that with AI, just as a shameless pitch for next month's April 13th, Monthly on Monday. It's artificial intelligence in support of teaching and mentoring. Maybe we should add in and research integrity investigations.
And I think they should they should create an AI program that will automatically update all of our teaching materials so that they're disability accessible, because that's been a big problem. And I've heard at other universities they have those tools available. So
well, we will bring that up at next month's meeting.
somebody should bring that up.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks to Dr. Streeter for his presentation today, and to everyone who stayed with us through the whole thing. See you next month.
Thank you. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.